So Oliver Glasner has announced that he'll be leaving Crystal Palace at the end of the month, and to no great surprise, comes amidst a massive transfer saga surrounding one of his key players. The Austrian tactician more or less confirmed his departure just moments after stating that Marc Guehi had more or less signed for Manchester City, and they were just dotting the I's and crossing the T's on that deal. And I think that's really interesting because he left Wolfsburg and Eintracht Frankfurt under very similar circumstances. I mean, we can start with his time at Wolfsburg, a club who have always traditionally yo-yoed up and down the Bundesliga table. He took them from being this kind of mid-table fodder of a team to Champions League qualification, and it seemed as though the club was all pointing in the right direction. Then all of a sudden he falls out with sporting director Jörg Schmadtke, and reports start to come out that Wolfsburg had gone back on promises to strengthen the squad to Glasner's demands. Now, undoubtedly, Glasner made the right decision moving to Frankfurt because he enjoyed tremendous success there. He took them from 11th to 7th in the Bundesliga, took them to 2 cup finals, and the all-important Europa League success in 2022. However, like his time at Wolfsburg, Glasner repeatedly complained about the lack of quality in his squad. The problem wasn't so much the players that Frankfurt were signing. During his time there, they picked up great players like Randall Colmoani and Mario Götze, but it was the fact that Frankfurt were replacing the players that they had sold with these new stars. It was like-for-like replacements rather than what Glasner wanted. He wanted to increase the strength of depth in that team so they could go on and challenge in other competitions and perhaps even better in the Champions League. His constant demands meant that he fell out with his boss, Marcus Krosche, who's still at Frankfurt and is considered something of a legend at the club. And before long, their relationship completely deteriorated. Now, you could certainly argue that Frankfurt have done perfectly well since Glasner left, but I think you could also state that they simply weren't willing to match Glasner's ambition and his short-term demands when he was at the club, and things fell apart very quickly. He had a very kind of notable tantrum in his final game against Hoffenheim where he kicked a bottle onto the pitch during the game, and then he blew up at a post-match press conference when reporters suggested that his players were no longer kind of committed or working hard enough. And I think it's really interesting to note that prior to leaving Frankfurt, his side had only won one of the last 10 games. And that's more or less where this Crystal Palace team are right now, prior to Glasner announcing that he's also leaving the club. You know, he's an exceptional head coach and he's shown at every club that he can do tremendous things. But at Wolfsburg and at Frankfurt and now at Crystal Palace, he struggled to work within a system that requires those clubs to sell key players each and every summer. Perhaps one of the most interesting but also frustrating things about Glasner as a head coach is that at each of these 3 clubs, his genius has been tripped up by his impatience. As I said, each and every situation and stint at these clubs, he's ultimately fallen out with the clubs because they simply refused to not sell their best players. And that's because each of these clubs work within a system where they have bigger clubs and richer clubs above them. And so I'd really like to see Glasner move on from Crystal Palace, potentially to a club where he doesn't have to worry about those economic factors. Obviously, we're talking about a Bayern Munich, a Juventus, a Man City, a Manchester United, but I feel like only if Glasner can get to one of these clubs and throw off the shackles of worrying about his best players leaving every season, will we really be able to see him at his absolute best? And that then leads us to where Glasner will go now after Crystal Palace. I suspect he probably won't have a huge amount of interest in going back to the Bundesliga unless it was something like Bayern Munich, which seems a little far-fetched at the moment. Maybe a club like Juventus might be tempted to take a punt on him, but I suspect he's probably more interested in maybe focusing and targeting on a top 6 club in the Premier League. Maybe something like Tottenham, maybe an Aston Villa, you never know. But, you know, there's Manchester City, there's Manchester United, perhaps even Chelsea on the horizon, all looking for head coaches this summer. And I'd be really intrigued to see how Glasner can do at those clubs. I think tactically, he's very adjustable. I think he's very flexible. I think at each of these clubs, he's shown that he can get the very best out of the players at his disposal. But it just comes down to what he can do and how far he can go as a head coach when he finally gets to a club where he doesn't have these constant arguments and bickering discussions with the club ownership over selling key players. But until then, we'll need to wait and see.